Hey everybody, Bormac here for some more reading. Planning on finishing the second half of The Lure of the Worm, which is chapter 3 in The Color of Magic, which, as far as I can gather, is a collection of shorter stories involving the early adventures of Rincewind. And Two Flower, who I don't think really plays a large part in the Discworld series after this point. But whatever. So I'm going to pick up on the previous paragraph because the next one starts up kind of indicating what they were talking about in the previous one. Alrighty? Good. Hmm. What is your name, dragon? Said Two Flower. I do not know. I think I shall call you Nine Reeds. That is my name, then. They waded through the all-encroaching dust in a series of huge, dark-pillared halls which had been carved out of solid rock, with some cunning, too. From floor to ceiling the walls were a mass of statues, gargoyles, bas-reliefs, and fluted columns that cast weirdly moving shadows. Dog? That cast weirdly moving shadows when the dragon gave an obliging illumination at Two Flowers' request. They crossed the lengthy galleries and vast carven amphitheaters, all awash with deep, soft dust and completely uninhabited. No one had come to these dead caverns in centuries. Then he saw the path leading away into yet another dark tunnel mouth. Someone had been using it regularly, and recently. It was a deep, narrow trail in the gray blanket. Two Flower followed it. It led through still more lofty halls and winding corridors, big enough for a dragon, and dragons had come this way once, it seemed. There was a room full of rotting harnesses, dragon-sized, and another room containing plate and chain mail big enough for elephants. They ended in a pair of green bronze doors, each so high that they disappeared into the gloom. In front of Two Flower, at chest height, there was a small handle shaped like a brass dragon. When he touched it, the brass door swung open instantly, and with disconcerting noiselessness. Instantly sparks crackled in Two Flower's hair, and there was a sudden gust of hot, dry wind that didn't disturb the dust in the way ordinary wind should, but instead whipped it up momentarily into unpleasantly half-living shapes before it settled again. In Two Flowers' ears came the strange, shrill twittering of the things locked in the distant dungeon dimensions. Out beyond the dark, out beyond the fragile lattice of time and space, shadows appeared, where there was nothing to cause them. The air buzzed like a hive. In short, there was a vast discharge of magic going on around him. The chamber beyond the door was lit by a pale green glow. Stacked around the walls, each with its own marble shelf, there were tier upon tier of coffins. In the center of the room was a stone chair on a raised dais, and it contained a slumped figure which did not move, but said in a brittle old voice, "Come in, young man." Two Flowers stepped forward. The figure in the seat was human, as far as he could make out in the murky light, but there was something about the awkward way it sprawled in the chair that made him glad he couldn't see it any clearer. "I'm dead, you know," came a voice from what Two Flower fervently hoped was ahead, in conversational tones. "I expect you can tell." Said Two Flower. "Yes." He began to back away. "Obvious, isn't it?" agreed the voice. "You'd be Two Flower, wouldn't you? Or is that later? Later? Said Two Flower. Later than what? He stopped. Well, said the voice, you see, one of the advantages of being dead is that one is released, as it were, from the bonds of time, and therefore I can see everything that has happened, or will happen, all at the same time. Except that, of course, I now know that time does not, for all practical purposes, exist. That doesn't sound like an advantage, said Two Flower. You don't think so? Imagine every moment being at one and the same time a distant memory and a nasty surprise. And you'll see what I mean. Anyway, I now recall what it was I am about to tell you. Or have I already done so? That's a fine-looking dragon, by the way. Or don't I say that yet? It is rather good. It just turned up, said Two Flower. It turned up, said the voice. You summoned it. Yes, well, You have the power. All that I did was think of it. That's what the power is. Have I already told you that? That I am Gritcha the First? Or is that next? I'm sorry. I haven't had too much experience with transcendence. Anyway, yes, the power. It summons dragons, you know. I think you already told me that, said Two Flower. Did I? I certainly intended to, said the dead man. But how does it... I've been thinking about dragons all my life, but this is the first time one has turned up. Oh well, you see, the truth of the matter is that dragons have never existed as you... And until I was poisoned some 3 months ago, I understand existence. I'm talking about the true dragon, Draconis nobilis. You understand. The swamp dragon, Draconis vulgaris, is the base creature, and not worth our consideration. The true dragon, on the other hand, is a creature of such refinement of spirit that they can only take form in this world if they are conceived by the most skilled imagination. And even then, the said imagination must be in some place heavily impregnated with magic, which helps to weaken the wall between the world of the seen and unseen. Then the dragons pop through, as it were, and impress their form upon this world's possibility matrix. Into the matrix. I was very good at it when I was alive. I could imagine up to, 500 dragons at a time. Now Liesa, the most skilled of my children, can barely imagine 50 rather nondescript creatures. So much for progressive education. She doesn't really believe in them. That's why her dragons are rather boring. While yours, said the voice of Gritcha, is almost as good as some of mine used to be. A sight for sore eyes that I have any, not that I have any to speak of now. Two Flower said hurriedly, you keep saying you're dead. Well, the dead, they don't talk much, as a rule. I used to be an exceptionally powerful wizard. My daughter poisoned me, of course. It's generally accepted. It is the generally accepted method of succession in our family. But, the corpse sighed, or at least a sigh came from the air a few feet above it. It soon became obvious that none of my children is sufficiently powerful to wrest the lordship of Wyrmberg from the other two. The most satisfactory arrangement. A kingdom like ours has to have one ruler, so I resolved to remain alive in an unofficial capacity, which of course annoys them all immensely. I won't give I won't give my children the satisfaction of burying me until there is only one of them left to perform the ceremony. It was a nasty wheezing noise. Two-Flower decided it was meant to be a chuckle. So, it was one of them that kidnapped us, said Two-Flower. Liesa, said the dead wizard's voice. My daughter. Her power is the strongest, you know. My son's dragons are incapable of flying more than a few miles before they fade. Fade? I did notice I could see through the one that brought us here, said Two-Flower. I thought that was a bit odd. Of course, said Grisha. The power only works near the Wyrmberg. It's the inverse square law, you know. At least, I think it is. As the dragons fly further away, they begin to dwindle. Otherwise, my little Liesa would be ruling the whole world now. If I know anything about it. But I can see I mustn't keep you. I expect you'll be wanting to rescue your friend. Two-Flower gulped. Run? He said. Not him. The skinny wizard. My son Njord is trying to hack him to pieces. I admired the way you rescued him. Will, I mean. Flower drew himself to his full height. An easy task. Not a very tall guy, Two-Flower. Okay, where was I? Okay. Where is he? He said, heading towards the door with what he hoped was a heroic stride. Just follow the pathway in the dust, said the voice. Liesa comes to see me sometimes. She still comes to see her old dad, my little girl. She was the only one with the strength of character to murder me, a chip off the old block. Good luck, by the way. I seem to recall I said that. Will say it now, I mean. The rambling voice got lost in a maze of tinses as Two-Flower ran along the dead tunnels, with the dragon loping along easily behind him. But soon he was leaning against a pillar, completely out of breath. It seemed ages since he'd had anything to eat. Why don't you fly? Said Nine Reeds inside his head. With the dragon spread its wings and gave an experimental flap, which lifted it momentarily off the ground. Two-Flower stared for a moment, then ran forward and clambered quickly onto the beast's neck. Soon they were airborne, the dragon skimming along easily a few feet above the floor, leaving a billowing cloud of dust in its wake. Two-Flower hung on the best he could as Nine Reeds swooped through a succession of caverns and soared around a spiral staircase that could have easily accommodated a retreating army. At the top they emerged into a more inhabited regions. The mirrors at every corner were brightly polished, reflecting a pale light. I smell other dragons. The wings became a blur as Two-Flower was jerked back. Two-Flower was jerked back as the dragon veered and sped off down a side corridor like a gnat-crazed swallow. Another sharp turn sent them soaring out of a tunnel mouth into the side of a vast cavern. There were rocks far below, and up above there were broad shafts of light from great holes near the roof. A lot of activity on the ceiling, too. As Nine Reeds hovered, thumping the air with his wings, Two-Flower peered up at the shapes of roosting beasts and tiny min-shaped dots that were somehow walking upside down. This is a roosting hall, said the dragon in a satisfied tone. As Two-Flower watched, one of the shapes far above detached itself from the roof and began to grow larger. Rincewind watched as Njord's pale face dropped away from him. It's funny, gibbered a small part of its mind. Why am I rising? Then he began to tumble into the air as reality took over. He was dropping to the distant guano-speckled rocks. Ew! His brain reeled with the thought. The words of the spell pickled pickled to the surface. They picked just that moment to surface from the depths of his mind, as they always did in a time of crisis. Why not say us? They seemed to urge. What have you got to lose? Rincewind waved a hand, in the gathering slipstream. Shanghai, he called. The word formed in front of him, a cold blue flame that streamed across the wind. He waved his other hand, drunk with terror and magic. Iberius, he intoned. The sound froze into a flickering orange word that hung beside its companion. Ushering Kavanti Pantham Nagrad Flamgangre. As the words blazed their rainbow of colors around him, he flung his hands back, prepared to say the eighth and final word that would appear in coruscating octarine and seal the spell. The imminent rocks were forgotten. He began. The breath was knocked out of him. The spell scattered, snuffed out. A pair of arms locked around his waist as the whole world jerked sideways. As the dragon rose out of its long dive, claws grazing just for a moment the topmost rock of the Wyrmberg's noisome floor. Two-Flower laughed triumphantly. Got him! The dragon, curving gracefully at the top of its flight, gave a lazy flip of its wings and soared through the cave mouth into the morning air. At noon, in a wide green meadow on the lush tableland that was the top of the impossibly balanced Wyrmberg, the dragons and their riders formed a wide circle. There was room beyond them for a rabble of servants and slaves and others who scratched a living here on the roof of the world. And they were all watching the figures clustered in the center of the grassy arena. The group contained a number of senior dragon lords, and among them were Liort and his brother Liartes. The former was still rubbing his legs with small grimaces of pain. Slightly to one side stood Liessa and Hrun, with some of the woman's own followers. Between the two factions stood Wyrmberg's hereditary lore master. As you know, he said uncertainly, the not fully late Lord of Wyrmberg, Gretcha I, has stipulated that there will be no succession until one of his children feels himself, or, as it might be, herself, powerful enough to challenge and defeat his or her other siblings in mortal combat. Yes, yes, we know all that. Get on with it, said a thin, peevish voice from the air beside him. The lore master swallowed. He had never come to terms with his former master's failure to expire properly. Is the old buzzard dead, or isn't he? He wondered. It is not certain, he quavered, whether it is allowable to issue a challenge by proxy. It is, snapped Gretcha's disembodied voice. It shows intelligence. Don't take all day about it. I challenge you. I challenge you, said Hrun, glaring at the brothers. Both at once. Liort and Liartes exchanged looks. You'll fight us both? Together? Said Liartes, a tall, wiry man with long black hair. Yeah. That's pretty uneven odds, isn't it? Yeah, I outnumber you 1-2. Liort scowled. You arrogant barbarian. That just about does it, growled Hrun. Oh! The lore master put out a blue-veined hand to restrain him. It is forbidden to fight on the killing ground, he said, and paused while he considered the sense of this. You know what I mean, anyways, he hazarded, giving up, and added, as the challenged parties, my lords, Liort and Liartes have choice of weapons. Dragons, they said together. Liessa snorted. Dragons can be used offensively, therefore they are weapons, said Liort firmly. If you disagree, we can fight over it. Yeah, said his brother, nodding at Hrun. The lore master felt a ghostly finger prod him in the chest. Don't just stand there with your mouth open, said Gretcha's graveyard of a voice. Just hurry up, will you? Hrun stepped back, shaking his head. Oh no, once was enough. I'd rather be dead than fight one of those things. Die then, said the lore master, as kindly as he could manage. Liort and Liartes were already striding back to across the turf toward the servants stood waiting with their mounts. Hrun turned to Liessa. She shrugged. Don't I even get a sword? He bleated. A knife even? No, she said. I didn't expect this. She suddenly looked smaller, all defiance gone. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You're sorry? Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I thought you'd said you're sorry. Don't glare at me like that. I can imagine you the finest dragon to ride. No! Our master wiped his nose on his handkerchief and held the little silken squirrel off for a moment, then let it fall. A boom of wings made Hrun spin around. Lort's dragon was already airborne, circling around towards him. As it swooped low over the turf, a billow of flame shot from its mouth, scoring a black streak across the grass that rushed towards Hrun. The last minute he pushed Liesa aside and felt the wild pain of the flame on his arm as he dived for safety. He rolled as he hit the ground and flipped onto his feet again while he looked around frantically for the other dragon. It came from the side, and Hrun was forced to take a badly judged standing jump to escape the flame. The dragon's tail whipped around as it passed and caught a stinging blow across his forehead. Pushed himself upright, shaking his head to make the wheeling stars go away. His blistered back screamed at him. Liort came in for a second run, but slower this time to allow for the big man's unexpected agility. As the ground drifted up, he saw the barbarian standing stock still, his chest heaving, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. An easy target. As the dragon swooped away, Liort turned his head, expecting to see a dreadfully big cinder. Instead, there was nothing. Puzzled, Liort turned back, Hrun heaving himself over the dragon's shoulder scales with one hand, beating out his flaming hair with the other, presented himself to his view. Liort's hand flew to his dagger, but pain had sharpened Hrun's normally excellent reflexes to needle point. A backhand blow hammered into the dragon lord's wrist, sending the dagger arcing away towards the ground, and another caught the man full on the chin. The dragon, carrying the weight of two men, was only a few yards above the grass. This turned out to be fortunate because at the moment Liort lost consciousness, the dragon winked out of existence. Liesa hurried across the grass and helped Hrun stagger to his feet. He blinked at her. What happened? What happened? He said thickly. That was fantastic! The way you turned that somersault in midair and everything. Yeah, but what happened? It's rather difficult to explain. Hrun peered up at the sky. Laertes was by far the most cautious of the two brothers, was circling high above them. Well, you've got about 10 seconds to try, he said. The dragons? Yeah, they're imaginary. Like all those imaginary burns on my arm, you mean? Yes. No! She shook her head violently. I'll have to tell you later. Fine. If you can find a really good medium, snapped Hrun. He glared up at Laertes, who was beginning to descend in wide sweeps. Just listen, will you? Unless my brother is conscious, this dragon can't exist. It's got no pathway through to this. Run! Shouted Hrun. He threw her away from him and flung himself flat on the ground as the arch-dragon thundered by, leaving another smoking scar across the turf. While the creature sought height for another sweep, Hrun scrambled to his feet and set off at a dead run for the woods at the edge of the arena. They were sparse, little more than a wide, overgrown hedge, but at least no dragon would be able to fly through them. It didn't try. Laertes brought his mount in to land on the turf a few yards away, and dismounted casually. The dragon folded its wings and poked its head in among the greenery while its master leaned against a tree and whistled tunelessly. I can burn you out, said Laertes after a while. The bushes remained motionless. Perhaps you're in that holly bush over there. The holly bush became a waxy ball of flame. I'm sure I can see movement in those ferns. The ferns became mere skeletons of white ash. You're only prolonging it, barbarian. Why not give in now? I've burned lots of people. It doesn't hurt a bit, said Laertes, looking sideways at the bushes. The dragon continued through the spinney, incinerating every likely-looking bush and clump of ferns. Laertes drew his sword and waited. Hrun dropped from a tree and landed, running behind him. The dragon roared and crashed through the bushes as it tried to turn around, but Hrun was running with his gaze fixed on Laertes and a dead branch in his hands. It is a little known but true fact that two-legged creature can usually beat a four-legged creature over a short distance, simply because of the time it takes a quadruped to get its legs sorted out. Run heard the scrabble of claws behind him, and then the ominous thump as the dragon half opened its wings and was trying to fly. Thrun bore down on the dragon. Lord Learte's sword came up wickedly to be caught on the branch. Then Hrun cannoned into him, and cannoned into him, and the two men sprawled on the ground. The dragon roared. Liartz screamed as Hrun brought a knee upward with anatomical precision, but managed a wild blow that broke the barbarian's nose for him. Hrun kicked away and scrambled to his feet to find himself looking up into the wild horse face of the dragon, its nostrils distended. He lashed out with a foot and caught Liartes, who was trying to stand up, on the side of his head. The man slumped. The dragon vanished. The ball of fire that was billowing towards Hrun faded until, when it reached him, it was no more than a puff of warm air. There was no sound but the crackle of burning bushes. Hrun slung the unconscious dragon lord over his shoulder and set off at a trot back to the arena. Halfway there he found Liort sprawled on the ground, one leg bent awkwardly. He stooped and with a grunt hoisted the man onto his vacant shoulder. Liessa and the lore master were waiting on a raised dais at one end of the meadow. The dragon woman had quite recovered her composure now, and looked levelly at Hrun, who threw the two men down on the steps before her. The people around her were standing in differential poses like a court. "Kill them," she said. "I kill in my own time," he said. "In any case, killing unconscious people isn't right." "I can think of a more opportune time," said the lore master. Liessa snorted. "Then I shall banish them," she said. "Once they are beyond the reach of Wyrmberg's magic, they'll have no power. They'll be simply brigands. Will that satisfy you?" "Yes." "I'm surprised that you're so merciful, Hrun." Hrun shrugged. "A man in my position, he can't afford to be anything else. He's got to consider his image." He looked around. "Where is the next test, then?" "I warn you that it is perilous. If you wish, you may leave now. If you pass the test, however, you will become Lord of the Wyrmberg, and, of course, my lawful husband." Hrun met her gaze, and he thought about his life to date. It suddenly seemed to him to have been full of long, damp nights sleeping under the stars, desperate fights with trolls, city guards, countless bandits, evil priests, and on at least 3 occasions actual demigods. And for what? Well, for quite a lot of treasure, he had to admit. But where had it all gone? Rescuing beleaguered maidens had a certain passing reward. But most of the time he'd finished up by setting them up in some city somewhere with a handsome dowry, because after a while even the most agreeable ex-maiden became possessive and had scant sympathy for his efforts to rescue her sister sufferers. In short, life had really left him with little more than a reputation and a network of scars. Being a lord might be fun. Hrun grinned. With a base like this, all these dragons, and a good bunch of fighting men, he could really be a contender. Besides, the wench was not uncomely. "The third test," she said. "Am I to be weaponless again?" said Hrun. Liessa reached up and removed her helmet, letting the coils of red hair tumble out. She unfastened the brooch of her robe underneath. She was naked. Hrun's gaze swept over her. His mind began to operate two notional counting machines. One assessed the gold in her bangles, the tiger rubies that ornamented her toe rings, the diamond spangle that adorned her navel, and 2 highly individual whirligigs of silver filigree. The other plugged straight into his libido. Both produced tallies that pleased him mightily. And she raised a hand and proffered a glass of wine. She smiled. "I think not." "Oh, jeez, am I to be weaponless again? Oh, gosh." "Oh, that's terrible." He didn't attempt to rescue you, Rincewind pointed out as a last resort. He clung desperately to Two Flower's waist as the dragon circled slowly, tilting the world at a dangerous angle. The new knowledge that the scaly back he was astride only existed as a sort of three-dimensional daydream did not, he had soon realized, do anything at all for his ankle-wrenching sensations of vertigo. His mind kept straying towards the possible results of Two Flower losing his concentration. Not even Hrun could have prevailed against those crossbows, said Two Flower stoutly. As the dragon rose higher above a patch of woodland, where the three of them had a damp and uneasy sleep, the sun rose over the edge of the disk. Instantly, the gloomy blues and grays of pre-dawn were transformed into a bright bronze river that flowed across the world, flaring into gold where it struck ice or water, or a light dome, owing to the density of the magical field surrounding the disk, or a light dam. Okay, like a dam in a river, except it dams light. Light itself moved at subsonic speeds. This interesting property was well utilized by the Sorka people of the Great Nef, for example, who over centuries had constructed intricate and delicate dams in the valleys walled with polished silica to catch the slow sunlight and sort of store it. The scintillating reservoirs of the Nef, overflowing after several weeks of uninterrupted sunlight, were truly a magnificent sight from the air, and it is therefore unfortunate that Two Flower and Rincewind did not happen to glance in that direction. In front of them, the billion-ton impossibility that was the magic-wrought Wyrmberg hung against the sky and was not too bad until Rincewind turned his head and saw the mountain's shadow slowly unroll across the across the cloudscape of the world. "What can you see?" said Two Flower to the dragon. "I see fighting on top of the mountain," came the gentle reply. "See," said Two Flower, "it's probably fighting for his life at this very moment." Rincewind was silent. After a moment, Two Flower looked around. The wizard was staring intently at nothing at all, his lips moving soundlessly. "Rincewind?" The wizard made a small croaking noise. "I'm sorry," said Two Flower. "What did you say?" "All the way, the great fall," he muttered. Muttered Rincewind, his eyes focused, looking puzzled for a moment, then widened in terror as he made the mistake of looking down. "Arg!" he opined, and began to slide. Two Flower grabbed him. "What's the matter?" Rincewind tried shutting his eyes, but there were no eyelids to his imagination. He was staring widely. Don't you get scared of heights?" he managed to say. Two Flower looked down at the tiny landscape, mottled with cloud shadows. The thought of fear hadn't actually occurred to him. "No," he said. "Why should I? You're just as dead if you fall from 40 feet as if you fall from 4,000 fathoms. That's what I say." Rincewind tried to consider this dispassionately, but couldn't see the logic in it. It wasn't the actual falling, it was the hitting Two Flower grabbed him quickly. "Steady on," he said cheerfully. "We're nearly there." "I wish I was back in the city," moaned Rincewind. "I wish I was back on the ground. I wonder if dragons can fly all the way to the stars," mused Two Flower. "Now that would be something." "You're mad!" "You're mad!" said Rincewind flatly. There was no reply from the tourist. And when the wizard craned around, he was horrified to see Two Flower looking up at the stars with an odd smile on his face. Don't you even think about it," said Rincewind menacingly. "The man you seek is talking to the dragon woman," said the dragon. "Hmm?" said Two Flower, still looking at the paling stars. "What?" said Rincewind urgently. "Oh yes, Hrun," said Two Flower. "Hope we're still in time. Dive now! Go low!" Rincewind opened his eyes as the wind increased to a whistling gale. Perhaps they were blown open. The wind certainly made them impossible to shut. The flat summit of Wyrmberg rose up at them, lurched alarmingly, then somersaulted into a green blur that flashed by either side. The tiny woods and fields blurred into a rushing patchwork, a brief silvery flash of landscape that may have been the little river that overflowed into the air on the plateau's rim. Rincewind tried to force the memory out of his mind, but it was rather enjoying itself in there, terrorizing the other occupants and kicking over the furniture. I think not, said Liesa. Run took the wine cup slowly and grinned like a pumpkin. Round the arena the dragons started to bay. Their riders looked up. Something like a green blur flashed across the arena, and Hrun was gone. The wine cup hung momentarily into the air, then crashed down on the steps. Only then did a single drop spill. This was because in the instant of enfolding Hrun gently in his claws, Nine Rings the dragon had momentarily synchronized their bodily rhythms. Since the dimension of imagination is much more complex than those of time and space, which are very junior dimensions indeed, the effect of this was to transform a stationary and priapic Hrun into a Hrun moving sideways at 80 miles an hour, with no ill effects whatsoever, except for a few wasted mouthfuls of wine. Another effect was to cause Liesa to scream with rage and summon her dragon. As the gold beast materialized in front of her, she leapt astride it, still naked, snatched a crossbow from one of the guards, and she was airborne. Then she was airborne. The other dragon riders swarmed towards their own beasts. The lore master, watching from the pillar, had prudently slid behind. From the pillar he had prudently slid behind in the mad scramble, happened at that moment to catch the cross-dimensional echoes of a theory being the same instant hatched in the mind of an elderly psychiatrist in an adjacent universe, possibly because of the dimensional leak was flowing both ways. For a moment the psychiatrist saw a girl on a dragon. The lore master smiled. "Want to bet that she won't catch him?" said Gretchen in a voice of worms and spelunchers right by his ear. The lore master shut his eyes and swallowed hard. "I thought that my lord would now be residing fully in the Dreadland," he managed. "I am a wizard," said Gretchen. "Death himself must claim a wizard. And, he doesn't appear to be in the neighborhood." "Shall we go?" asked Death. He was on a white horse, a horse of flesh and blood, but red of eye and fiery nostril, and he stretched out a bony hand and took Gretchen's soul out of the air, rolled it up until it was a point of painful light, and then he swallowed it. Then he clapped spurs onto his steeds and sprang into the air, sparks coruscating from his hooves. "Lord Gretchen!" whispered the old lore master as the universe flickered around him. "That was a mean trick," came the wizard's voice, a mere speck of sound disappearing in the infinite black dimensions. "My lord, what is death like?" called the old man tremulously. "When I have investigated it fully, I will let you know," came the faintest modulations on the breeze. "Yes," whispered the lore master. A thought struck him. "During daylight, please," he added. "You clowns!" screamed Hrun from his perch on Nine Reed's foreclaws. "What did he say?" roared Rincewind as the dragon ripped its way through the air in a race for the heights. "Didn't hear!" bellowed Two Flower, his voice torn away by the gale. As the dragon banked slightly, he looked down at the little toy spinning top that was the mighty Wyrmberg, and saw the swarm of creatures rising up in pursuit. Nine Reed's wings pounded and flicked their way through the air contemptuously. Thinner air, too. Two Flower's ear popped for the third time. The head of the swarm, he noticed a golden dragon, someone on it, too. "Hey, are you all right?" said Rincewind urgently. He had to drink several lungfuls of the strangely distilled air in order to get the words out. "I could have been a lord, and you clowns had to go in," said Hrun. Hrun gasped as the chill thin air drew the life even out of his mighty chest. "What's happening to the air?" muttered Rincewind, blue lights appearing in front of his eyes. "Unk!" said Two Flower, and passed out. The dragon vanished. And for a few seconds the three men continued upwards, Two Flower and the wizard presenting an odd picture as they sat in front of one another, their legs astride something that wasn't there. Then what passed for gravity on the disc recovered from the surprise and claimed them. At that moment Liessa's dragon flashed by, and Hrun landed heavily on its neck. Liessa leaned over and kissed him. This detail was lost to Rincewind as he dropped away with his arms still clasped around Two Flower's waist. The disc was a little round map pinned against the sky. It didn't appear to be moving, but Rincewind knew that it was. The whole world was coming up at him like a giant custard pie. "Wake up!" he shouted above the roar of the wind. "Dragons! Think of dragons!" There was a flurry of wings as they plummeted through the host of pursuing creatures, which fell away and up. The dragon screamed and wheeled across the sky. No answer came from Two Flower. Rincewind's robe whipped around him, but he did not wake. "Dragons," thought Rincewind in a panic. He tried to concentrate, tried to envisage a really lifelike dragon. If he can do it, he thought, then so can I. Nothing happened. The disc was even bigger now, a cloud-swirled circle rising gently underneath them. Rincewind tried again, screwing up his eyes and straining every nerve in his body. A dragon! His imagination, a somewhat battered and overused organ, reached out for a dragon. Any dragon. "It won't work," laughed a voice like the dull toning of a funeral bell. "You don't believe in them." Rincewind looked at the terrible mounted apparition, grinning at him. His mind bolted in terror. There was a brilliant flash. There was utter darkness. It's a soft floor under Rincewind's feet, a pink light around him. The sudden shocked cries of many people. He looked around wildly. He was standing in some kind of tunnel, which was mostly filled with seats, in which outlandishly dressed people had been strapped. They were all shouting at him. "Wake up!" he hissed. "Help me!" Dragging the still unconscious tourist with him, he backed away from the mob until his free hand found an oddly shaped door handle. He twisted it and ducked through and slammed it hard. He stared around the new room which he found himself, and he met the terrified gaze of a young woman who dropped the tray she was holding and screamed. It sounded like the sort of scream that brings muscular help. Rincewind, awash with fear-distilled adrenaline, turned and barged past her. There were more seats here, and the people in them ducked as he dragged Two Flower urgently along the central gangway. Beyond the rows of seats were little windows. Beyond the windows, against a background of fleecy clouds, there was a dragon's wing. It was silver. "I've been eaten by a dragon," he thought. "That's ridiculous," he replied. "You can't see out of dragons." Then his shoulder hit the door, the far end of the tunnel, and he followed it through into a cone-shaped room that was even stranger than the tunnel. It was full of tiny, glittering lights. Among the lights were contoured chairs. There were 4 men who were now staring at him open-mouthed. As he stared back, he saw their gazes dart sideways. Rincewind turned slowly. Beside him was a 5th man, youngish, bearded, and swarthy as the nomad folk of Great Neff. "Where am I?" said the wizard. "In the belly of a dragon?" The young man crouched, shoved a small black box in the wizard's face. The men in chairs ducked down. "What is it?" said Rincewind. "A picture box?" He reached out, and it took it a moment, which appeared to surprise the swarthy man, who shouted and tried to snatch it back. There was another shout, this time from one of the men in chairs, only now he wasn't sitting. He was standing and pointing at something small and metallic at the young man. It had an amazing effect. The man crouched back in his hand, with his hands in the air. "Please give me the bomb, sir," said the man with the metallic thing. "Carefully, please." "This thing?" said Rincewind. You have it. I don't want it." The man took it very carefully, put it on the floor. The seated men relaxed. One of them started speaking urgently to the wall. The wizard watched him in amazement. "Don't move!" snapped the man with the metal. An amulet, Rincewind decided. It must be an amulet. The swarthy man backed into a corner. "That's a very brave thing you did," said the amulet holder to Rincewind. "You know that? What? What's the matter with your friend?" "Friend?" Rincewind looked down at Two Flower, who was still slumbering peacefully. That was no surprise. What was really surprising was that Two Flower was wearing the new clothes, strange clothes. His breeches now ended just above his knees. He wore some sort of vest, brightly striped material. On his head was a ridiculous little straw hat with a feather in it. An awkward feeling around the leg regions made Rincewind look down. His clothes had changed too. Instead of the comfortable old robe, so marvelously well adapted for speed into action in all possible contingencies, his legs were encased in cloth tubes. He was wearing a jacket of of the same gray material. Until now, he'd never heard the language the man with the amulet was using. It was an uncouth and vaguely hublandish. So why could he understand every word? Let's see. They'd suddenly appeared in this dragon after they'd materialized in this they'd struck up a conversation in the airport, so naturally they'd chosen to sit together on this plane. And he promised to show Jack's Wildboom around when they got back to the States. Yeah, that was it. And then Jack had taken ill, and he'd panicked and come through here and surprised a hijacker. Of course, what on earth was hublandish? Dr. Rincewind rubbed his forehead. What he could do with was a drink. Ripples of paradox spread out across the sea of casuality. Possibly the most important point that would have to be borne in mind of anyone outside the sum totality of the multiverse was that, although the wizard and the tourist had indeed only recently appeared in the aircraft in midair, they had also, at one and the same, been riding in that airplane in the normal course of things. That is to say, while it was true that they had just appeared in this particular set of dimensions, it was also true that they had been living in them all along. It is at this point that normal language gives up and goes to have a drink. The point is that several quintillion atoms had just materialized, however they had not, see below, in a universe where they should not have strictly been. The usual upshot of this sort of thing is a vast explosion, but since universes are fairly resilient things, this particular universe had saved itself by instantaneously unraveling its space-time continuum back to a point where the surplus atoms could safely be accommodated, then rapidly rewinding it back to that circle of firelight with which, for want of a better term, its inhabitants were wont to call the present. This had, of course, changed history. There had been a few less wars, a few extra dinosaurs, and so on, but on the whole, the episode had passed remarkably quietly. Outside this particular universe, however, the repercussions of the sudden double take bounced to and fro across the face of the sum of things, bending whole dimensions and sinking galaxies without a trace. All this was totally lost on Dr. Rincewind, Rincewind, 33, a bachelor born in Sweden and raised in New Jersey, specialist in the breakaway oxidation phenomena of certain nuclear reactors. Anyway, he probably wouldn't have believed any of it. Zoe Blumen still seemed to be unconscious. The stewardess who had helped Rincewind to a seat to the applause of the rest of the passengers was bending over him anxiously. "We've radioed ahead," she told Rincewind. "There'll be an ambulance waiting when we land. It says on the passenger list that you're a doctor." "I don't know what's wrong with him," said Rincewind hurriedly. "It might be a different matter if he was a Magnot's reactor, of course. Is it shock of some kind? I've never—" Her sentence terminated in a tremendous crash from the rear of the plane. Several passengers screamed. A sudden gale swept every loose magazine and newspaper into a screaming whirlwind that twisted madly down the aisle. Something else was coming up the aisle. Something big and oblong and wooden and brass-bound. It had hundreds of legs. If it was what it seemed, a walking chest of the kind that appeared in pirate stories, brim full of ill-gotten gold and jewels. Then what had been its lid suddenly gaped open. There were no jewels, there were lots of big square teeth, white as sycamore, and a pulsating tongue, red as mahogany. The ancient suitcase was coming to eat him. Rincewind clutched at the unconscious Weiblumen for what little comfort there was, and gibbered. He wished fervently he was somewhere else. There was sudden darkness. There was a brilliant flash. The sudden departure of several quintillion atoms from a universe that they had no right to be in anyway caused a wild imbalance in the harmony of the sum of totality, which it tried frantically to retrieve, wiping out a number of sub-realities in the process. Huge surges of raw magic boiled uncontrolled around the very foundations of the universe itself, welling up through every crevice into hitherto peaceful dimensions, causing novas, supernovas, stellar collisions, wild flights of geese, and drowning imaginary continents. Worlds as far away as the other end of time experienced brilliant sunsets of coruscating octarine as highly charged magical particles roared through the atmosphere. In the cometary halo around the fabled ice system of Zerut, a noble comet died as a prince flamed across the sky. Confusing. All this, however, was lost on Rincewind, clutching the inert two-flower around their waist as he plunged towards the disk sea several hundred feet below. Not even the convulsions of all the dimensions could break the iron law of the conservation of energy. Rincewind's brief journey through the plane had sufficed to carry him several hundred miles horizontally, and 7,000 feet vertically. The word plane flamed in Rincewind's mind. Was that a ship down there? The cold waters of the Circle Sea roared up at him and sucked him down into their green, suffocating embrace. A moment later there was another splash, as the luggage, still bearing the label, carrying the powerful traveling rune TWA, also hit the sea. Later on they used it as a raft. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Got a little confusing towards the end, huh? Well, stay tuned next time, guys, for the last chapter of The Color of Magic, Close to the Edge. I'll see you guys there.